What's good? It's Woog. I'm going to talk a little bit about the biggest fights that just took place over the weekend. We're going to talk a little boxing and MMA. I'm going to start, though, with TSZYU's 9th round stoppage TKO win over Tony Harrison. That was, the biggest boxing fight on the schedule. And the word that comes to mind is certified. For anybody who had doubts, including myself, I actually picked Tony Harrison to win that fight via decision. For anybody who had doubts on TSZYU and whether or not he is elite, whether or not he is deserving and ready for a title shot, this fight and this win over Tony Harrison certified TSZYU. There are certain fights, opponents, wins that do that for a fighter. And this was that moment for TSZYU. Regardless of whether you had the scorecards at the time of the stoppage, whether you had it, 6 rounds to 2, which is how I had it at the time, I saw that all 3 judges had it 5 rounds to 3. I thought that was a little bit generous towards Tony Harrison. And then I saw that Steve Farhood had it, I believe, 7 rounds to 1 for TSZYU. And I thought that that was a little bit too generous to TSZYU. But I could conceivably get all 3 of those scorecards, 7-1, 6-2, or 5-3. Outside of the first round, which I felt like Tony Harrison, he just did more in the first round, it's difficult to find another round to definitively give him. So that's why I could understand, the variety of scorecards there. And what I was wondering going into this fight is whether Tony Harrison was going to be able to kind of control range and to try to keep the fight near the middle of the ring. Now, I get it. This was a smaller ring. I don't think that you can make too much of that in this case, although there is a case to be made about the size of the ring. That's why certain fighters choose certain ring sizes, right? But it became abundantly clear to me that by the 3rd round, Tony Harrison's back was touching the ropes way too much. Even if he was fighting valiantly off the ropes, which he was catching TSZYU with certain uppercuts. But aside from those momentary, times where he would really let his hands go, he was more or less just sticking the jab out and trying to gain TSZYU's respect with that, which he was catching him with the jab, especially in the early rounds where you could see him kind of rocking TSZYU's head back. But TSZYU, call me crazy, but he kind of reminded me a little of Canelo Alvarez. I'm talking about the patient stalking, where you're very economical in your movement. There's not a lot of wasted movement with TSZYU, nor is there with Canelo Alvarez. And it's a selective punch output, but those punches you are throwing, you're throwing with, with maximum intent and accuracy. Now, TSZYU was whiffing with some of his punches, but at least according to CompuBox, I believe he landed like 46% of his power punches. So again, very economical, better defense than advertised. I mean, he was getting hit with some of those Tony Harrison jabs and against a few of those uppercuts, but with the high guard and his style of patiently stalking, I think that TSZYU's defense is better than advertised, especially because he's not really going head over skis in pursuing the opponent. He's doing so responsibly, patiently, kind of, doing little subtle things. He's not like a demonstrative feinter. He's not doing a ton of that to set up his power punches. But I feel like there's like a mental pressure that he's applying, because I couldn't understand how he was, prior to this fight, backing Terrell Goucher up into the ropes without throwing a lot of jabs or doing a lot of movement, cutting the ring off, feinting your way into position to then back the opponent up into the ropes. I was wondering how he was able to pull this off without a lot of activity. Well, in this fight versus Tony Harrison, it looked like as much as Tony Harrison didn't want his back to touch the ropes, it's almost like he was left with no other choice but to back up against the ropes and then to try to fight off the ropes. And it just seemed like that was a losing proposition. And it wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when Tony Harrison would succumb to the overwhelming power punching ability of TSZYU. And he eventually did in the 9th round. And, I don't know where Tony Harrison goes from here. He seemed pretty dejected by the end of that one. And it was, there was no real controversy in this fight. And Tony Harrison congratulated TSZYU and basically said the better man won, and I don't know what I'm going to do going forward. But this means a ton when it comes to analyzing or at least projecting Tim TSZYU's likelihood of success against Jermell Charlo. Like, I've seen an array of opinions about this matchup going forward. You know, I saw Boxing Wave raise the question on Twitter, is Tim TSZYU a more of a pressure, or does he apply more pressure than Brian Castano, or something like that? I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but my response to that is, it's a different type of pressure. Brian Castano, I feel, is a more sustained pressure. He's moving his feet more and doing more to cut the ring off and to throw more punches. Whereas, again, Tim TSZYU, it's a patient hunting style. Very economical in movement, more selective in the punch output, but maybe more efficient per punch than Brian Castano. So, look, Jermell Charlo was a part of this broadcast, and it sounded like he had, you know, he basically gave the blanket statement, the generalization that, hey, Tim TSZYU did what he had to do. But there's so much more to it. I feel like Jermell Charlo was more impressed by that Tim TSZYU performance than he was leading us to believe in that moment where he was giving his live commentary as Tim TSZYU broke down and stopped Tony Harrison. Now, I do think that Jermell Charlo is a better mover than Tony Harrison. I was a little unimpressed by Tony Harrison's movement. I thought that he had a good jab working for him, but the movement, the lateral movement, it wasn't enough for me. It's like, you're really just gonna play the front and back game without the side-to-side movement, without that dimension against Tim TSZYU. That's why I felt like it wasn't a matter of if, it's when Tony Harrison gets stopped. Once you start eliminating that side-to-side movement, you're just left with the front and back. And Tim TSZYU was able to figure that out. It wasn't too hard to find Tony Harrison at that point. Because again, once you're touching the rope, not only are you not moving side to side, which Jermell Charlo was lending the commentary telling us what Derrick James would tell him in moments like that, basically instructing him to move side to side. Well, if you're Tony Harrison and you're not moving side to side, and now your back is touching the rope, so now you don't even have that front and back activity anymore, right? Because the ropes are behind you. There's less range management that Tim TSZYU then has to do to reliably connect cleanly with you, because now you've eliminated 2 dimensions from your defense at that point. So yeah, Tony Harrison, I wasn't that impressed with his approach here. Again, I thought that he fought valiantly. I thought that even the rounds that Tim TSZYU was winning leading up to the stoppage, I thought that some of them were more competitive than the broadcast would lead us to believe. But again, I was still giving Tim TSZYU the vast majority of those rounds. Super impressive victory for Tim TSZYU. It sure as hell is forcing me to reevaluate his game in my mind. He showed me a lot there. I mean, his poise was another thing that was a little Canelo-like, where even if you're getting kind of jabbed and this guy looks like he's flashing perhaps better hand speed or superior reach, like, to me, this wasn't too dissimilar from Canelo versus the much taller Callum Smith. There are differences in that fight, of course, but I'm talking about the patient style and the patient approach that Tim TSZYU was applying with Tony Harrison here. To me, it wasn't too dissimilar from what I've seen from Canelo in the past. Very impressive performance, and now, yeah, I can't wait for this Jermell Charlo title defense against Tim TSZYU. You know, beforehand, I was saying, what has Tim TSZYU really done to earn this title shot? Well, now we've seen what Tim TSZYU has done to earn this title shot. And yeah, I'm gonna have to reevaluate, and we'll, you know, have some analytical talk going forward. But Jermell Charlo, I like his stabbing jab to the body. I think he mixes his jab attack high and low, mixed with his side-to-side movement to give Tim TSZYU more to think about, more to look at. And I think that this fight against Tony Harrison hit a point where Tim TSZYU no longer respected Tony Harrison's punching power, to where he was more demonstrative and more assertive in walking him down. You've got to be much more careful than that against a puncher like Jermell Charlo. So yeah, it's not apples to apples in projecting what we should expect from Tim TSZYU against Jermell Charlo, because Jermell Charlo has more dimensions to his game and has vastly superior punching power that cannot be overlooked here. But let's move on to Tony Yoka and his loss to Carlos Tackum. I thought that this was either going to be a Tony Yoka win via decision or a Tony Yoka stoppage over Carlos Tackum. By the way, I had suggested that this was a 12-rounder in my preview. I apologize about that. This was a 10-rounder, and if it was a 10-rounder, I would have picked Tony Yoka via decision as opposed to via stoppage. But I've got to really reevaluate if Tony Yoka has a path forward. Like, I don't want to question a fighter's level of gameness or their level of dog, if you will, but Tony Yoka, like his loss to Martin Bakole, it just seemed like there was a point in this fight versus Carlos Tacam where Tony Yoka more or less circled the wagons and said, okay, I don't want to get beaten up and stopped. So I'm going to do enough to make it out of these rounds, enough to make these rounds look somewhat competitive, but I'm not going to do enough to adjust and try to win these rounds and do whatever it takes to turn this fight around. I didn't see that gear in Tony Yoka's game. And one thing that was interesting about this matchup, and I highlighted this going into the fight, but I still picked Tony Yoka to win the fight, was that although Tony Yoka had like a 6-inch height advantage, he only had like a 1-inch reach advantage. And you could see that play out here because Carlos Tackum, he was able to time and throw that right hand. He loves throwing that looping right hand. And you could tell that when Tony Yoka was in range to hit Carlos Tackum was also in range to fire back with that right hand counter, and Tony Yoka did not like that. Nor did Tony Yoka like those punches to the body. Tony Yoka, he was intimidated, I thought, at a certain point against Carlos Tacam. I think that he was convinced that Carlos Tacam is really about it, and Carlos Tacam has been in enough dogfights where, hey, it's either kill or be killed. And Carlos Tacam is not scared of getting knocked out. When you're fighting a fighter who seems like they're more willing to risk it all than you are, I feel like there's a psychological component to that, and I think that we saw Tony Yoka met with that challenge, and basically in the fight or flight, he stayed in there and he made it out of the fight, but in terms of doing what it takes to win the fight, I feel like he flew and didn't fight. He didn't fight his way back into the fight, if you will, and I didn't see any real adjustments from Tony Yoka. He doesn't really sit down on his punches either. Like, there just wasn't a lot to spook Carlos Tackum. And Carlos Tackum's been in there with Anthony Joshua. He's gotten knocked out by Derek Chisora. He's been in there with a lot of dangerous guys, and Tony Yoka didn't show him anything that he hadn't seen before, and that showed as well. So we'll see what Tony Yoka's got going forward, but I've got some big questions on where he goes from here. But yeah, that was a significant win for Carlos Tackum. And you like seeing those moments from some of these gatekeepers, from some of these journeymen, if you will, when they have a moment where they are a significant underdog and they do enough to pull off the win. So congrats to Carlos Tacam there. And yeah, very disappointing consecutive setback for Tony Yoka. Diego Pacheco stopped Jack Cullen. Congratulations to Diego Pacheco. He's looking like a real problem. Can't wait to see him in another step-up fight because, this Jack Cullen fight was a step-up of sorts. And, I mean, we just saw what Diego Pacheco did to him. And it's interesting. These were two 168-pounders that were like at least Callum Smith's height or taller. Diego Pacheco's listed at like 6'4", and Jack Cullen was listed at 6'3". So, yeah, I really want to see how they're going to matchmake for Diego Pacheco going forward. I would love to see him versus Edgar Berlanga, but I don't think they're going to do that, to the newly signed to Matchroom Edgar Berlanga. So, yeah, we'll see what they do with Diego Pacheco going forward. But, yeah, keep your eyes on him. And then in the UFC, who has ever done that to Piotr Jan before? Merab Dvalishvili just won all 5 rounds in the main event against who I once upon a time considered to be the most dangerous man at bantamweight. I thought that, yes, Aljamain Sterling has always been an interesting matchup for Piotr Jan. They had the first fight that resulted in the DQ. Aljamain came away with the title, and then Aljamain, actually beat Piotr Jan in the rematch. But aside from that, I thought that Piotr Jan might be the best in the division. And then we saw him lose that controversial, disputed, very close and competitive fight against Sugar Sean O'Malley. Again, disputed fight. but I have never seen anybody just work Petr Yan like that. That was pretty impressive. To see DVALISHVILI just take it to him, setting the record for most takedown attempts. Yes, he landed a small percentage of those takedowns, but he got some of them, and just his consistent foot on the gas, treadmill from hell style, it was just overwhelming for Petr Yan. He was beating Petr Yan in the stand-up, in the grapple. Petr Yan just looked like he was wanting this thing to be over with. This was a grueling pace, and Petr Yan just didn't have an answer for it. And yeah, look, DVALISHVILI sounds like he does not want to fight his basically his teammate, Aljamain Sterling. Dana White is saying that's a bad idea to not take your title shot once it's presented, but I don't know who DVALISHVILI is going to fight next because he and Aljo are teammates. But man, this was an impressive performance, and you've got to like think really hard about who you would favor against DVALISHVILI after that performance against Petr Yan. I was not expecting that, and you know, looking at the betting odds, most people were not expecting anything close to that, especially 5 rounds to 0. All 3 judges, I think, had it 50-45. So yeah, this was a shocking, or should I say shockingly, lopsided performance and a domination over Petr Yan. I did not think I would see Petr Yan get dominated like that anytime soon, but DVALISHVILI just did that. So we'll see how the bantamweight division shapes up. We know that Aljamain Sterling's about to fight Henry Triple C Cejudo in Cejudo's return. I can't wait to see that one. But yeah, DVALISHVILI's a bad boy, and I really have to think about who has shown me that level of cardio before, especially with such a grapple heavy style. That oxygen tank is just unreal. Like seriously, even when Petr Yan would do something good, look at how quickly DVALISHVILI would respond with something or make a quick adjustment and outmaneuver Petr Yan moment by moment by moment. Usually it's Petr Yan coming on strong in the late rounds and overwhelming his opponents with his increasingly voluminous style. Like usually it's Petr Yan heating up as the fight persists. No, that wasn't the case here. He got beat round after round after round, and yeah, that was hugely impressive. So yeah, that's a quick wrap up over at least of the most important fights of the weekend. Let me know your thoughts on TSZYU versus Tony Harrison. Let me know your thoughts on Tony Yoka versus Carlos Tackum, as well as Diego Pacheco versus Jack Cullen, and then that UFC card, the fight night featuring Petr Yan dropping all 5 rounds against Merab DVALISHVILI. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.